There are roads we choose and roads that choose us. A man learns this if he lives long enough. The freight roads of Wyoming territory are written in the snow in winter, cut into the rock in summer, marked by the bones of animals and the graves of men who mistook the wilderness for something forgiving. Micah Crawford had been running freight between mining towns for 16 years, and he knew the terrain the way a sailor knows water, not with affection, but with respect. The roads were the business. The road was all that mattered. Until the morning a woman with a knife nearly cut him open on a mountain pass. He was 42 years old and looked older. The sun and cold of the Wyoming territory did that to a man's face. Micah Crawford had a square jaw buried under a thick, dark brown beard, steel blue eyes that had learned not to register surprise, and skin the color and texture of weathered rawhide. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat over layers of wool, the kind of coat that had belonged to his father and would likely belong to someone else after he was gone. His hat was a wide, flat-crowned gray, felt with ear flaps tied down, and his gloves were thick leather, stained with the oils of rains and the blood of animals he'd had to shoot on the trail. A coiled bullwhip hung from his belt, not for cruelty, but because the roads demanded it sometimes. His boots were tall and mud-caked, the leather scarred from 1,000 miles of snow and stone. His wife had left him 3 years ago for a shopkeeper in Cheyenne. The shopkeeper had a store and clean hands and could give her a life that didn't smell of mule sweat and wind. Micah had not argued. He understood the difference between a woman's life and a freight hauler's life. He had married one to the other, and she had chosen differently. Now he ran his route alone with 2 mules and a wagon, and he had learned to prefer solitude to company. Company meant conversation. Conversation meant pretending to care about things beyond the next road and the next town, and whether the river would freeze solid enough to cross. This was February 1884. The Wyoming territory that winter had teeth. The temperature had dropped below 0 at night for a month straight. The passes were clogged with snow 5 feet deep. A man could ride for 6 hours and see nothing but white and more white. The sky and the earth collapsed into the same pale nothing. The wind moved across the whiteness with the sound of something alive and hungry. It cut through layers of clothing and found skin. It found any exposed flesh and burned it white. Men had died on these passes. Micah had found 2 bodies in previous winters, frozen so hard they had to be carried in wagons like cordwood. The wilderness did not judge. It did not ask who deserved mercy. It simply killed or let live, and the difference between the two seemed to come down to luck and an animal's willingness to keep moving forward, when forward meant 1 more mile of cold. Micah had been on the trail for 11 days, hauling mining equipment and dry goods from Rawlins to a settlement called Sweetwater, a 200-mile route that twisted through 3 major passes. The wagon was loaded with cast iron pipe, wooden crates of canned goods, barrels of lamp oil, and boxes of blasting powder. The freight weighed close to 3,000 pounds. The mules that pulled it were Wyoming mules. Tough animals, the kind that knew the passes, that could find the trail even when snow had obliterated the ground beneath. Micah trusted them more than he trusted people. The mules would not lie. They would not leave. They would not promise forever and then ride away toward a better life in Cheyenne. He was on the descent from the highest pass when he saw the shape on the trail ahead. At first he thought it was a piece of canvas or a hide left by hunters. The snow had buried it partially, and the wind was blowing the drifts across the shape in waves. He slowed the mules and squinted. Something was wrong about the shape. It was too uniform, too regular. It was the size of a person. It was a person. Micah pulled the wagon to a stop 20 yards away. His hand moved to the knife at his belt. Bandits sometimes worked these passes in winter, wounded and desperate, willing to kill for a coat or a mule. He had dealt with 2 in his years on these roads. The first he had fought, the second he had shot. He kept his hand on the knife and waited to see if the shape moved. It moved. An arm came up through the snow, and then a face, and Micah saw that it was a woman. Apache. Young, maybe 25. Her face was sharp and angular, with high cheekbones, and the kind of dark, intense eyes that seemed to calculate distances and angles. Her long black hair was pulled back in a single thick braid wrapped with strips of white cloth. She was wearing a layered deerskin dress under a heavy woven blanket of red and black stripes. Her moccasins were wrapped with fur strips. In her right hand she held a knife, and she was on her feet in one motion, legs braced, the knife angled at Micah's throat. "Do not come closer," she said in English that carried the weight of careful learning. "I will cut you open." Micah raised both hands slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you." "No man says that unless he plans to hurt." She stepped backward, keeping the knife between them. Behind her, the snow shifted, and Micah saw the cradle board. A baby's face was visible in the folds of rabbit fur. It was so small, impossibly small in this frozen wilderness. "I am Paloma. My son is Kaya. We are going to the Mescalero. You will let us pass." "I'm not stopping you." Micah kept his hands visible. "I have a wagon. I have blankets. I have food. I can take you toward the Mescalero reservation if that's where you need to go." Paloma's eyes narrowed. This was the calculation. She was deciding whether he was the kind of man who meant what he said or the kind who used kindness as a knife. Micah understood the calculation. He had done the same thing to strangers in towns where a stranger could mean death. "How far?" she asked. "The nearest Mescalero band is sheltering in a valley about 60 miles south. 5 days if the weather holds. 3 if the snow clears." He did not move. "I can get you there." Paloma lowered the knife slightly. "There are soldiers hunting. They have orders to bring us back to the reservation. We escaped during the winter transfer. Many died in the transfer. The soldiers do not care. They have orders." "How far behind are they?" 2 days, maybe 1. They know the passes." Micah knew what helping her meant. He knew it immediately and completely. There were rewards for returning runaways. There were also legal complications for harboring them. There was the danger of the army itself. Lieutenant Ames Whitaker commanded the patrol. Micah had heard stories. Whitaker was not a cruel man, but he was dutiful in the way that made cruelty almost inevitable. He followed orders exactly. A man like that was more dangerous than a bandit, but Micah had a wagon and supplies and knowledge of the passes that cut time off the routes. He could get them there, and his business was carrying freight. What was a woman and a baby but a different kind of freight? What was the weight of a child in rabbit fur compared to the weight of mining equipment and conscience? "Get in the wagon," he said. "I'll cover you with canvas." Paloma climbed into the wagon bed, and Micah spread the canvas over her and the cradle board. She kept the knife in her hand. Micah did not ask her to put it away. They both understood that she would use it if she needed to. He wrapped her in 2 blankets and gave her a bottle of water and cold biscuits. Then he turned the wagon and angled it away from the main pass, toward a narrower trail that climbed higher and would take longer, but would also be less traveled. The soldiers would follow the main road. The main road was predictable. Micah Crawford had never been predictable in his life. The first night they sheltered in a stand of pines at the edge of a frozen meadow. Micah built a fire using wood he had carried in the wagon, and he made coffee and heated a stew of dried meat and flour. Paloma sat across the fire from him, the baby wrapped against her chest. She ate slowly and did not speak. The baby made small sounds, small animal sounds, the sounds of hunger and cold. Paloma produced a cloth and fed the baby from her body, her movements efficient and practiced. Micah looked away. He had not been around women in so long that the simple fact of her breathing seemed to require his attention. He focused on the fire instead. "What is your name?" Paloma asked. It was the first question she had asked that was not about distance or food or danger. "Micah Crawford. Are you married?" "No." "You were once." It was not a question. "Yes. She left you for a better man. For a man with cleaner hands." Paloma nodded, as if this explained everything. Maybe it did. They did not speak for the rest of the night. When Micah finally slept, he dreamed of his wife's face and woke before dawn with the sense that he was forgetting something important. Outside the shelter, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. They traveled for 2 more days on the same high route. The landscape opened into a vast white kingdom. The snow was so deep that the wagon wheels broke through the top crust and sank almost to the hubs. The mules were laboring. On the morning of the 4th day, Micah saw horse tracks crossing their trail from the east. Soldiers. 2 sets of tracks, then 4, then 6. Whitaker's patrol had left the main pass and was cutting across the high country. They were closing the distance. Micah made a decision. He would not follow the high route anymore. He would drop into the valleys and navigate the frozen river system. It would be slower and harder on the mules, but the army would be expecting him to climb. They would expect him to follow the ridge. Instead, he would go down into the cold places where the sun did not reach and where the paths were hidden by the snow. That afternoon, they reached a frozen river. It was the North Platte, wide and still, its surface a sheet of gray-white ice covered in 3 feet of snow. The crossing would take 2 hours. Micah studied the ice from the bank. It was thick enough. It had to be. There was no other way. "Stay inside the wagon," he told Paloma. "Do not move no matter what happens. Keep the baby quiet. If something happens to me, if the ice breaks, you understand?" Paloma nodded. She understood. She had understood from the moment Micah found her on the trail that survival was a matter of doing what was necessary and not questioning it until afterward. If there was an afterward. He led the mules down the bank and onto the ice. The first 20 yards were solid. The ice groaned under the wagon's weight, but it held, and he could feel the sound through the soles of his boots. The ice was telling him something. It was old. It was thick. It had formed in November and hardened through December and January. It should hold. The mules moved carefully, testing each step. 30 yards, 40. The landscape seemed to stretch in every direction. White sky above, white earth below. The distinction between them blurred and dreamlike. The middle of the river was wider than Micah had estimated, or the current was stronger, or the winter had not been cold enough everywhere equally. Sometimes the cold was not evenly distributed. Sometimes water closer to the bank froze solid, while water in the middle, with its faster current, stayed thinner. He was 50 yards out when he heard the ice sing. a long, high, terrible sound, the sound of stressed crystal, the sound of something holding past its limit. The wagon lurched. The ice beneath the right side wheels cracked and dropped. Water, dark and impossibly cold, was visible through the widening gap. It smelled like stones and time and the earth itself. Micah shouted. The mules screamed. He whipped them forward, and they threw themselves into the harness, and the wagon, suspended now between solid ice and breaking ice, began to move. The crack widened. The wagon tipped. Supplies spilled onto the ice. A case of powder and ammunition fell into the water. A box of dried meat followed. The wagon's bed tilted at a terrible angle, and Micah could see the baby's cradle board sliding toward the gap. He was out of the wagon and running. He grabbed the cradle board and Paloma's arm together and pulled them both away from the edge of the break. They fell onto solid ice as the wagon lurched and tipped fully. The back wheels broke through. For a moment, the entire wagon hung suspended, and then it slid backward into the black water with a sound like a scream. The ice collapsed behind it. Supplies and equipment and trade goods vanished into the North Platte. His freight, his livelihood. The wagon he had maintained sank until only a corner of the bed was visible above the water. Micah stood on the ice and stared at the hole. The water was so cold that anything in it would be solid in minutes. His supplies were gone. Half his equipment was at the bottom of the river. What remained were the mules, some of the heavier cargo that had not been in the wagon bed, and the clothes on his body. It was enough to walk. It was not enough to run a freight business. It was not enough to provide for anything except forward motion and the completion of this one task. He looked at Paloma. Her face was completely still. The baby had not made a sound during the fall. "Can we reach the camp on foot?" she asked. "Yes." "How long?" "1 day, maybe 2 if the snow worsens." They began walking. They had no choice. Behind them, the soldiers would still be coming, still following the high pass route. The wagon was gone, but there were no other wagons on this route. No freight, no business, just 2 people and 1 child walking through snow toward a camp that existed in the landscape like a dream exists in memory. That night, they sheltered in a snow cave that Micah carved into a drift against an outcropping of rock. It took him nearly 3 hours, working with a piece of flat bone in his hands, pushing the snow backward and letting gravity pull it down behind him. His fingers went numb. His beard froze solid. The wind tried to push him out of the cave as he worked, and twice he nearly gave up. There were shelters farther on, closer to the camp. But they would not reach them before dark, and traveling in the dark on a frozen mountain pass was a way to die fast. The cave would have to be enough. When it was finally deep enough, large enough, he pulled Paloma and the baby inside. It was deep enough for all 3 of them, and small enough that their body heat would matter. The cave was dark except for the fire Micah built from pine branches and twisted bark. The smoke rose and found a way out through cracks in the ceiling. The cold air itself seemed to have weight here, as if the mountain was pressing down on them from above. Paloma arranged the rabbit fur and blankets into a nest. She laid the baby down and wrapped him in layers with the deliberate care of someone who understood that the difference between life and death was the difference between wet and dry, between exposed and covered. Then she began to sing. The song was in Apache, or perhaps in a dialect Micah did not recognize. It was high and strange and so beautiful that he had to stop moving and just listen. The melody seemed to move through the small space as if it had substance, as if it could warm as effectively as the fire. He had not heard a woman's voice raised in song in more than 3 years. He had not heard anyone sing at all. After his wife left, he had lived in a world of wind and mule sounds and the creak of wagon wheels. The sound of a human voice, a woman's voice, lifted in something that was not words but was somehow more powerful than words, seemed to come from another world entirely. A world where there was warmth and safety and the kind of time that allowed for beauty. She sang for nearly an hour. The baby slept, and Micah watched the firelight move across her face and saw something in her expression that he recognized. It was the look of someone who had learned to carry impossible things and had not let the weight break her. Outside, the wind moved across the land like something alive, and inside the snow cave there was only the mother's voice and the light from a small fire and the breathing of animals keeping each other warm. When she finished, she did not speak. She lay down next to the baby and closed her eyes. Micah sat by the fire and held watch. Sometime in the small hours of the morning, the baby woke crying, not with hunger or pain, but with the small distress of cold. Paloma was too exhausted to tend it immediately. Without thinking about it too much, Micah reached over and gathered the child into his hands. The baby was impossibly small. The weight of him was less than 3 pounds of flour. His head fit in the palm of Micah's hand. Micah had not held anything that small since his daughter was born, and she had died before her 2nd birthday. Scarlet fever in the winter of 1869. He had held her while she died. He had not held anything alive and small in 15 years. The baby quieted. Micah sat by the fire and held this small human being and felt something inside his chest break and begin to heal at the same time. Paloma slept. The baby slept. The wind sang in the snow. And Micah Crawford sat awake as he had sat awake for 16 years, alone with the weight of things, except this time the weight was not his alone. They left the cave at dawn. The snow had stopped, and there was light breaking through the clouds. The ridge they had to climb was visible above them, sharp and white against a pale blue sky. They climbed slowly. Paloma walked, and Micah walked, and together they climbed toward the pass that would open onto the valley where the Mescalero camp was sheltering. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The soldiers were behind them, and the pass was ahead of them, and the choice to carry them this far had already cost him everything, except the capacity to carry them 1 mile further. They crested the pass at midday. The snow was still falling, a gentle fall now, almost mist. And below them, in a valley that opened like a hand, they saw the camp. There were dozens of fires, hundreds of them, smoke rising in thin columns against the gray sky. There were horses, hundreds of horses, gathered in sheltered areas among the rocks. There were people moving between structures made of hide and wood, structures that Micah recognized as wickiups and traditional shelters, built with knowledge that went back generations. There were hundreds of them, warriors and women and children and elders, all of them having made the same escape journey Paloma was completing now, all of them sheltering together in the winter mountains. The sight of it stopped Micah in his tracks. He had never seen so many people in such a remote place. He had never seen a civilization this complete, this functional, this far removed from the mining towns and settlements he knew. This was not a refuge. This was a nation that had reclaimed itself from whatever had tried to contain it. Paloma stopped walking. She stood at the crest of the pass and looked down at her people. Her face did not move. Her expression remained still and careful, as it had been for all 60 miles. But Micah could see that something had broken open in her. Not the hardness that had kept her alive, but the possibility of something else. The possibility that she had made it, that her son had made it, that there was a world beyond cold and hunger and walking. Warriors emerged from the camp as they began the descent. They came on horseback, moving quickly across the snow, their horses' dark shapes against white, their movement purposeful but controlled. They surrounded Micah and Paloma without threatening, forming a circle around them but keeping their distance, giving space for understanding to happen. An older man rode forward, probably 60, his face carved by decades of sun and wind, his posture suggesting a lifetime of leadership. Probably the chief, probably named Nantan, based on the stories Micah had heard in trading posts and mining towns. Stories told in low voices by men who understood that the politics of this territory were more complicated than the newspapers claimed. The chief looked at Micah for a long moment. His dark eyes were intelligent and assessing. Then he looked at Paloma, really looked at her, taking in the journey she had made, the weight she had carried, the distance she had traveled. Then he looked at the baby, at the small face visible in the rabbit fur wrapping, the child who was Paloma's future and the Mescalero band's future, the reason the journey had been made in winter when it could have been made in spring. Then he looked back at Micah. "The winter almost killed them," the chief said. His English was better than Paloma's, more practiced. "The river did," Micah said. "The winter was just cold." Nantan nodded. He turned to his warriors and spoke in Apache. Two of them dismounted and came to help Paloma and the baby. She resisted for a moment. This woman who had walked 60 miles on foot, who had given birth in winter, who had nearly cut Micah open when she first saw him. And then she let them guide her to a horse. A warrior helped her mount, and she sat the horse with the baby against her chest and her face turned toward the valley and her people. "My people will repair your wagon," Nantan said. "My wagon is at the bottom of the North Platte. We will build you a new one, better than the old. We will give you 3 mules. We will give you information about a pass that cuts 20 miles off your route to Sweetwater. It goes through our land, but you may use it always. In spring, my wife will make you a buffalo hide coat. You have earned it." Micah had not asked for any of this. He had not helped Paloma for what she might become, or what she might give. He had helped her because she was alive and needed help, and his wagon was there. It was practical. It was transactional. You moved freight. You moved people. You moved whatever needed moving. But standing at the edge of the Mescalero camp, his hands empty and his wagon gone and his livelihood rewritten into something smaller and stranger, he understood that the road had chosen him after all. It had chosen him the moment he saw a shape in the snow and decided not to pass by. The road was not something you traveled on. It was something that traveled through you, something that made decisions in your chest before your mind caught up. He had lost freight worth nearly $2,000. He had risked his life multiple times. He would lose months of work returning the repaired wagon to the freight routes. But he would also be known differently now. He would not be the man who passed by. He would be the man who carried something that mattered. He would be the man who walked 60 miles through winter and arrived. They made him sleep in a lodge that night. They fed him venison and gave him coffee. An old woman with a weathered face tended the frostbite on his fingers. Someone gave him new socks. Another woman gave him a comb and a blade and helped him clean his beard. No one asked him to leave. No one offered him money. It was understood that he had carried freight, and the freight had arrived. The debt was not coins. The debt was what came next. He stayed for 2 weeks while the camp's craftsmen built him a new wagon. They used pine and ash and reinforced the bed with iron bar. The work was meticulous. They understood wagon construction the way the miners understood blasting, through generations of knowledge, through trial and error refined into expertise. They made it stronger than the old one, made it to last. The wheels were new, the axles straight, the joints precise. When they were finished, they stood back and admired their work with the satisfaction of men who knew what good work looked like. They gave him 3 mules that were better than the 2 he had lost. Younger, stronger, with better wind, animals that would carry him reliably through the next decade of freight routes. They drew him maps showing the protected paths that cut through their territory. The maps were drawn on hide, marked with symbols that indicated water sources, safe shelter sites, places where the wind was least harsh. The chief explained that Micah could use this pass always, that the mescalero would recognize him as a man who had earned passage. The chief's wife, a woman named Chogan with silver in her hair and a face that suggested she had survived more winters than most people saw in a lifetime, made him a buffalo hide coat from a hide that had been cured during the previous winter. She worked on it for days, cutting and sewing with a needle made from bone, stitching seams that were perfectly even and would last as long as the hide lasted. She dyed portions of it with plant materials that had been gathered from the mountains. She lined it with the thickest fur Micah had ever felt. When she was finished, she wrapped it in cloth and handed it to him without ceremony. It was the finest coat Micah had ever worn. It was the finest gift he had ever received. It was the gift of a people saying thank you in the only language that mattered, through work, through craft, through materials made with care. Paloma never came to him during those 2 weeks. He saw her sometimes with the baby, moving through the camp. She was different, stronger. She had crossed a line and arrived on the other side. She did not owe him anything, and he did not expect anything. The baby, Kaya, which meant name in Mescalero, slept more now. He had stopped crying. He would grow. He would become a man or a woman and walk on the same roads that his mother had walked. He would remember nothing of the frozen pass, or the cave, or the wagon sinking into the river. Micah left on the morning of the 15th day. He loaded his new wagon with his remaining supplies. He checked the mules. He put on the buffalo hide coat and felt the weight of it, the warmth of it, the way it changed how he sat in the saddle. The entire camp came to watch him go. The chief walked with him to the edge of the valley. They did not shake hands. They did not embrace. The chief put one hand on the neck of the lead mule and said something in Apache, and the mule calmed. Then Nantan stepped back, and Micah Crawford drove his wagon forward into the pass that would take him down to the flatlands and eventually to the mining towns and the roads that needed freight. It was 3 months later, in May, when he crested a ridge on his new route, using the protected pass the Mescalero had given him. The road was beautiful then, green and full of light. A rider appeared on the ridge ahead of him, moving toward him from the south. As they drew closer, Micah saw it was a woman on a good horse, and the woman was Paloma. She was alone. The baby was strapped to her back in the cradle board, wrapped in rabbit fur, sleeping or watching the world pass. Paloma pulled her horse to a stop. Micah pulled his mules to a stop. They were 20 feet apart. She raised one hand. It was not a wave. It was the gesture of a person acknowledging the presence of another person across a distance that had become too far to cross on foot. Micah raised his hand. They sat that way for a moment, the woman and the man and the child between them, suspended in the light of the spring morning. The roads of Wyoming stretching in every direction. The wilderness that had almost killed them, now simply the world they moved through. Then Paloma turned her horse and rode back the way she had come. Micah turned his wagon toward Sweetwater. They did not speak. They did not need to. They had already said everything there was to say on a frozen mountain pass, in a snow cave while a woman sang, in the moment when a wagon sank into dark water, and a man discovered that he was the kind of freight hauler who would carry something that mattered. Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. If this story stayed with you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments. Would you have given up everything to help a stranger? The frontier was full of people who chose compassion when it cost them. Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.